All right, welcome back, everybody. I am so excited today to present to you Cristal Sampson. I'm going to let you introduce yourself with all your credentials. She's a former client that was just a model client. As far
Mm.
as like, as soon as we got your time management under control, you were like, easy breezy.
Easy breezy, yeah, yeah.
But
Thank
yeah, go
you.
ahead and introduce yourself.
Yes, so my name is Cristal Sampson, and I work as a psychiatric nurse practitioner, seeing patients in Connecticut and New York. I'm a Yale School of Nursing graduate, and yeah, former client of yours. Definitely found myself in need of some executive functioning coaching, and I often recommend your services and services like yours for
Yes, thank
patients
you.
who both have, of course, who have ADHD or even just, executive functioning difficulties, sans ADHD diagnosis, because I feel like almost everyone can benefit from that sort of work.
That is a very good point that I think a lot of people don't know is everyone can be, higher or lower in certain executive functions. And it
Mhm.
doesn't mean that you have ADHD because you are. And
Yeah.
so that's a very good point to bring up. But something that I've been wanting to talk to you about is trauma, which is
Mm,
just a heavy subject, but
Can be.
yeah, so I'm just gonna let you lead the way. We've been having a little bit of a conversation before. I know I have, experienced I've heard about like big T trauma and little T trauma.
Mhm.
And I've definitely experienced both. And
Mm.
I do feel like for looking at myself and looking at like friends around me that things from our childhood could continue to affect us if we don't handle them properly. And I guess we're here today to talk about like, what does that look like? Handling it properly. Like, what is the prevalence of trauma amongst people with ADHD? Like, what's your knowledge on the subject?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, yeah, you brought up a ton of points. Um, Gosh, there's so much. Well, how about I start with a definition that I really like from Kathleen Wheeler. She is also a psychiatric nurse practitioner. She is a scholar, a professor at the University of Fairfield, I believe, as of present day. And in one of her books that I have, one of her textbooks, she defines trauma as an event or series of events that overwhelm an individual's ability to cope and or significantly disrupts their physical, emotional, social, or spiritual well-being. And I really like this definition because to me it highlights just how broad of a definition trauma is, right? Just how all-encompassing it can be. The definition of trauma pretty much leaves no one out, right? Because if you look at it, you can certainly see ways in which what you've experienced could constitute trauma. You talk about big T trauma versus little T. Big T trauma, I suppose that would relate to things that appear to seem obvious, right? So to speak, right? Catastrophic events, right? Experiencing natural disaster, abuses of any and all kinds, inflicted upon a person, could qualify as big T trauma. But you mentioned executive functioning and how it sort of exists on a spectrum. I would say that this so-called big T, little T trauma also happens in degrees, right? Because I would say a big T trauma is witnessing any one of the so-called, big T traumas, just witnessing, right? It's not even happening to you, but just bearing witness to it. can be absolutely traumatizing enough to be, considered big T, or at least affect you like any other big T trauma might.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so it's a matter of degrees. Little T trauma, that to me is the most profound, one of the more like important um ways to define trauma. Little t is pretty much the one that's like inescapable, right? Like it's almost like you're not, everyone has had a little t trauma. The most potent to me and most common is actually like the trauma of emotional neglect.
Mm.
Emotional neglect from early caregivers is a so-called little t trauma, as in like no one's talking about it, no one's in uproar, no one's like trying to give you emergency services for it. However, the impact can be incredibly long-lasting and incredibly pervasive. Little t traumas, if you ask me, trauma is trauma, pain is pain, suffering is suffering.
Mm.
Um, but these kinds of trauma you often see like play out in relationship. And that would be relationship to self and all that entails, right? Relationships to your behaviors, even that I would consider that a part of relationship to self, relationship to your thoughts, relationship to your emotions, all of it, relationship to self, everything that comes under that umbrella. Relationship to others, you see that a lot. You see that play out a lot in relationship to others. In fact, I've had patients that like present quite well, right? Like everything seems to be going fine. Like they're like picture perfect model of a person. Everything looks good, like great career, like they're on time, they're organized, they pay their visits on time. Everything looks good, they look good, well presented. And then like you hear about how their relationship is with their like spouse or partner, and it's like, whoa, like this is a different person. Something is happening. Something is happening.
Yeah.
So yeah, I see the relationship as being very incredibly sensitive to these little t traumas, these traumas of emotional neglect, emotional unavailability, which accumulate over time. A lot of us have had caregivers in childhood who first and foremost were emotionally unavailable to themselves, and therefore it's it's an impossibility for them to spontaneously give the sort of like attention and availability that we need as children. These this the emotional aspect of child rearing is so important. It's a part of what literally helps us ground and center. Like even I'm talking even as infants, like
Mhm.
our caregivers' ability to self-regulate and to self-attend to what's going on in their internal world has an impact on us. If they're unable to do that, we feel that early.
Yeah.
And if they are able to do that, now you become a safe landing space. You're safe. You're my protector. I can be here with you, right? So yeah, incredibly pervasive, incredibly ubiquitous. I would even say that's like the biggest reason for any and all of us to work on our own selves is because, the things that we sort of leave behind or try not to look at or try to bottle up or, box away, it has an impact on us and that thus has an impact on others, especially like the vulnerable ones, right, in society, right? The young ones, the
Yeah.
ones that look up to us. Um, I also, I call that sort of thing like, the traumas that need our healing attention. I, you know, it's a little radioactive. And by that I mean, a lot of us, we tend to have these experiences that are incredibly, incredibly, incredibly painful. And we box them up and we try to sort of shove them in the far corner closet of our mind and, hope that that is enough to kind of like keep us away from it and just back into the real world, back into real time in our lives. But it's radioactive. Like it's like warm, warm, warm from the closet, right? And in what ways is it radioactive? Like I mentioned, it's radioactive in the ways that it affects our relationships to everything, self, world, and others.
It's so interesting that you use that term boxing it up because that's the way I always used to put it is like you would box it up and put it away. And I would always kind of like put on this front so that like everything is fine. Everything's
Mm,
okay. You guys just get
mm,
your stuff together. When I would
mm,
watch other people, rightly so, struggle, I'm
mm,
like, no, you just put that stuff away and move on and soldier up.
mm.
And then I realized as time went on that like then those boxes start to rot.
Oh, yes. That is so okay. So the thing about the boxing it up, in this case, or coping mechanisms in all cases, which I would consider that a coping mechanism of yours, the boxing up the feelings and things, is that there was a time in which that worked. There was a time and a place in which that was the answer. In the environment in which that solution was born is the only environment in which that solution works. The
Yeah.
issue becomes when we leave the environment that created that coping mechanism that we start to have issues, right? That's when we start to have problems. Something that worked and was a solution and seemed reliable and helped us survive and helped us cope becomes toxic, right? Outside of that environment. So yeah, when it comes to things like boxing things up and any other coping mechanism, my first thing that I, tell my patients is to view these ways of being first and foremost through a lens of gratitude because they saved us, man. Like
Yeah.
they saved us. They're a problem now, right? Now that we're autonomous and we're adults and we're accountable and responsible and we've got the autonomy, it's an issue and we're out of the house, it's an issue. But it was 100% a savior. I mean, it was the thing that saved us. So always with gratitude, I try to approach those behaviors first, and then look into how we can begin to swap those behaviors out for healthier mechanisms.
That's so validating and makes so much sense because I
Mm,
look at my teenagers now and I see them try to deal with their emotions and sometimes they're just coming at them so fast and they don't even understand why they're upset and so they're kind of
mm,
unable to like suss them out and deal with them. And
yes,
I remember feeling that as a teenager. And that's when that tactic of boxing it up and putting it away was useful when I was a teenager, when I didn't know any other way to handle it. And
put
then
it
I
out.
carried it into 30s, my 30s. Like I just kept it going. And then it caused like depression and anxiety and things like that because I didn't have somebody smart like you
Oh,
to tell me this no longer works for you.
it sounds like it was kind of telling you it wasn't working. It was just a matter of like, I don't know what else to do. So,
Exactly.
that's what good therapy can do, right? It can give
Mhm.
you other ways to cope with the stressors. So I'm glad that you've even, got to the point where you understood that that wasn't working for you anymore. Many
Yeah.
of us live a whole life, perish, and never get rid of that sort of thing. So good for you.
It's funny because I had an experience where my husband, um, had just a lot of, he went into anaphylactic shock at one point because he got bit by an ant, which we didn't
Oh
even
my
know he was
God.
allergic to ants. Like he had to go into the emergency room for another thing. There was like all these, I was joking at the time, like he just keeps trying to die this month. Like, and my friend's like, how are you dealing with that? And I'm like, I'm fine. And she's
Oh.
like, she was smart enough to go, that's an odd response. And
Mm.
she's like, "You're fine?" And I'm
Mhm.
like, "Yeah, I'm fine." And it I don't know if in the moment I realized it or if it took me a little bit or if it was maybe her questioning me a little bit
Mhm.
where I'm like, "Oh, there's
Mhm.
that same coping mechanism of like
Mhm.
box it up, soldier on,
Mhm.
just deal with it." And I was like, "Okay, that's not a normal response to what I've been dealing with." And that's just good information at that time. But I appreciate having that friend that was like, "Are you sure? Are you sure you're
Mm.
fine?" But I
Mm.
had to express to Crystal before the call that I had written in a college type setting about a traumatic thing in my life, and it kind of set me on a spiral for a
Mm.
week. And you were telling me about
Mhm.
writing and how that could have been better helpful than just writing that one paper that one time.
Yes, I was loosely recalling an Andrew Huberman episode in which he spoke about like the healing powers of writing. And the so-called healing powers of writing comes from research that was actually done, I believe, on college students where they were tasked to write about an incredibly traumatic experience. And the research found that day one of writing was the worst, was the worst, the worst, the worst, the worst. Most painful, most discomfort, just terrible, right? And so when we feel that way, the natural response is to want to back away from that feeling and from the material causing that feeling. However, what the research showed that the very next day, they had the students write again, and then they noticed that their responses were much more muted than the first day. And then I believe it was by the third day, people started to actually gain insight. People started to actually have an understanding that perhaps they weren't able to have before because they never were able to look at the source material, from which you can gain insight. And then, some healing actually begun once you are consistent and you have this consecutive writing. But most of us don't get past like a day one experience like that, right? So we would never know that, behind that day two and day three and so on, that there can actually be, um, a potential transformation of our response to that same traumatic material.
Yeah, I love hearing that. That is such an action item to take away from this to,
Mhm.
maybe with the help of your therapist or
Yes.
whatever it might be, with some
Hmm.
support,
Hmm.
going through that writing exercise. Um, but
That's
yeah,
correct.
I love hearing that. Another thing I brought up that I have been interested in, it's actually on my not now list. I have a
Mhm.
now, not now list for my time management, and it's been
Nice.
on my not now list to look into EMDR.
Mm.
And I loved hearing your positive feedback on that. Can you explain to people what that is?
Oh my gosh, can I? It's so complicated. Well, it's like slightly mysterious EMDR. That's what I tell my patients when I introduce it. Which I'm not a specialist in EMDR. As a psychiatric nurse practitioner, I mainly provide medication management. And there's some sort of, what I call like processing therapy in which, we sort of like explore, through curiosity and questioning and like great quality listening, we can get somewhere. But if we need specialized care, go to a specialist. So EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization reprocessing. It is a therapy specifically created to treat traumatic stress of any and all kinds, really. And whereas there are other therapies that can be modified to focus on trauma, EMDR is like, it's the one. It was made for this. The thing that I most love about this therapy is that the risk of re-traumatization is much, much lower than traditional talk therapy. I was telling Mandy, right? So in a traditional talk therapy session, if you are wanting to get at the traumatic material, you just have to state it out loud to the therapist and consequently to your own ears. And even just hearing about the traumatic material can elicit, and does for many people, elicit traumatic stress responses that can then, right, negatively impact you, like you mentioned before with the writing, for days, for weeks. So with EMDR, the material, the traumatic material is targeted in this particular way that sort of takes your conscious thinking out of it, right? Because the body keeps the score. So this stuff is in there, right? It's in the subconscious, it's in the body, it's accessible. You don't need to talk about it to access it and to treat it and to potentially heal it, right? So EMDR does that. And it does it through the first two letters of that acronym, the eye movement. Eye movement, it's a placeholder for any bilateral stimulation, right? So that can be, and you may have heard of this, or the listeners, that could be, tapping alternately on your own thigh. That can be the back and forth eye movement, and any sort of bilateral stimulation in this way. And the desensitization, I mean, traumatic stress, I mean, that is a sensitivity heightening state. So there's desensitization that happens and there's reprocessing that happens. That's kind of to me a part of the mystery. But yeah, it's an incredible therapy. Studies have shown that especially like early on in a traumatic event, if you can get EMDR treatment, your chances of improving, like improving as in like no more PTSD, is quite high, right? So I'm thinking, a traumatic loss, or like a traumatic accident, or like if you can get into an EMDR therapist quickly, you can actually stand a chance of like eliminating that diagnosis.
Oh.
And then for the rest of us who have like accumulated little T traumas that could still absolutely be targeted by EMDR, I would say give it a try. It's so exceptional. I love EMDR. I'm so glad it exists.
Oh, so good to hear. Now, how is that different, or maybe it's just a form of, but
Mhm.
what about NLP, neuro linguistic programming?
So I'm actually not terribly versed in NLP.
Okay.
Maybe you can share a little bit with us.
I was just reading this morning all about trauma,
Hey.
as you do.
As you
I,
do.
but they definitely brought that up towards the last bit of what I was reading. I think it was in The Body Keeps the Score. I was reading a summary of that and they were talking about it. And I know as much as you do. I've only heard of it.
Mhm.
I, I know it's a thing. I just didn't know exactly what that was. And I just
What
made a
that
mental
thing.
note to like look into it.
See, perhaps this is my sign. I need to look into it as well. Because it's always good to have an option of therapies to recommend to patients. So I'll have to do my diligence and look into this therapy as well. Thank you.
Well, something that I know I experience and a lot of my clients experience,
Mhm.
and I'm curious if this is tied to having past traumas, but an inability to soothe yourself, an inability to rest,
Yes.
that type of thing. What would you
Oh
say to
yeah.
that? How do we learn to do that?
That is such a wonderful question. That's so good. I would say, mm, to rest. I'm making a note, so that I make sure I can get back to this. I would say this sort of ties into my theory about how trauma, um, can be potentially a catalyst for a person, to begin to experience ADHD symptoms, in their life. And my sort of theory is that there's a trauma of being left that to me seems to, mm, affect or influence, um, like ADHD or ADHD symptoms. And that trauma of being left can be a big T trauma of being left or a little t trauma of being left.
And when say being left, you mean like abandoned?
Left. Any of it. So big
Mm.
T trauma being left could be your early caregivers are totally drug addicted and they're not in the house, they're not available, they are not there. You are left in that way. Little T trauma of being left, and this is so common, could be the fact that you are like, a gifted kid, a bright kid, and like your parents are like, oh, you got it, left, right? So there's so many levels and degrees of being left. There could even, this one is harder to talk about because what do you do? How do you solve it? How do you prevent it? But like even like your busy parents, like leaving for work all the time, out of the house for hours and hours, and and then they get home and they just want to relax and they're tired and they don't really have a lot of time to, deal with what you've got going on. That's a version of being left, and that can absolutely, be a traumatic experience. So this goes also back, I feel like this ties into what I mentioned, at the top of the, podcast is needing to be around our people, our early caregivers, like sort of borrowing their calm as kids. Here's another way that we're left. Super anxious parents, super depressed parents, or even moderately anxious and depressed. That's a form of leaving. Um, Not being present is a form of leaving, is a form of abandonment. It's hard to talk about because it is so common. And again, it's the
Yeah.
feeling of, what do I do? I have to go to work. What do I do? I have to think about the future. Well, if you can imbibe your life with a bit more presence, that is going to help a lot. ADHD is pretty common, and so are these traumas of being left in all of the levels of T, right? So I really do, I see a bit of a, correlation there. And so yes, rest, that deep rest and that deep self-soothing seems to me to be like coming from like the parent-child connection. Like the deep, like, I need to soothe, I can't quite get it because we didn't quite have it or have it consistently. Now,
Yeah.
what to do about it? I would say, what to do? Oh, I would say there's a lot of healing in being present. There's a lot of destruction in not being present, and there's a lot of healing in being present. So the more that we can be where our bodies are, the better able we are to begin to rest and to soothe. But the more that we are here and we are there, we are where we were when things happened to us, we are where we want to be, we're, anywhere but here is gonna make it hard to rest and soothe. So come back here, find some sort of security, comfort, safety here, however you might find it. And often it's like the simple things that can help us feel calm and safe and grounded where we are. That could be anything from like having your favorite like super soft blanket or your favorite super soft socks. I hear this a lot in like treatment for like ADHD and autism is like these like all the strategies you can think of that help you to feel safe, calm, no matter how cringy or what have you, like do it. And make
Yeah.
it personal, right? Make it personal. One of the ways that I sort of engage rest is meditation. I know that can be really, really tough for many people. Any bit of meditation works, you know, that's meditation right there, right? Anything that once again brings you where your body is going to be present and can be meditative and can help sort of be the groundwork for that, good deep rest and soothing that you're looking for.
And presence is such a problem these days, especially with cell phones and things like that. Like, when are we ever truly present?
Mm. It's so, yeah, it's funny. Presence is a problem. Again, presence is a solution. The problem are all the things that take from the present moment. How do we do it? There are some questions where the answer is the question. How do you do it? You do it. Like it's like so sometimes when you get to sort of distill to the core, I've had these sort of conversations a lot with patients. It's like, well, how do I? And we start getting closer and closer to a core of the answer. And then we like hit this thing where you don't go any further. There are no other answers
Mm.
besides turning that question into like a period and taking like the question piece off the front, and that's your answer. So it's trying, it's practicing, it's doing the what is it, to try and to practice is to do. So just try and practice, and you're doing it by virtue of trying and practicing. So unfortunately, like that's kind of the answer. And I know a lot of us, like, we kind of want it to be like bigger, grander, more profound. But I think there's a lot of profundity in simplicity. I mean, I think it shows itself even just in what I said before about, the answer being in the question. So I would say that's how you kind of have to try to practice.
Yeah, I was doing that research this morning and there was so much about de-stressing and I was asking that question, how do I de-stress? And I was going through kind of like all of the like confusion about it really, but I
Mhm.
love your answer. Like, we just have to try things and see what works for us.
At the end of the day, that's the only step forward is the trying of the things. We can gain a lot of knowledge, and knowledge is power and important, pivotal. Um, but nothing is going to substitute the trying.
Yeah. So what if we are at the stage where we are parents who now have older kids, or we are the kids
Mm,
of the parent? Like, maybe we were the parent that wasn't as present as we would have liked to have been, or maybe we had parents that weren't as present as we needed.
yeah.
What what do we do now?
Mm. See, I like to think of my work as like being at an intersection between like the psychiatric and the spiritual. And that question of what do we do now that we've discovered that some past events are very actively influencing our lives, our behaviors, our personalities, our choices, our decisions, our relationships now. What do we do? That immediately gets me thinking about some more spiritual solutions. And what is that? To me, like the spiritual is the personal. So it's like something that you can't necessarily get like a universal answer to. To me, that's something that like you must discover, something that no amount of external information is going to give you. I think this is where the road of information kind of like stops, like the bus stops here, and now you get off the bus of information and you go explore. I think that's the spiritual aspect. I think that's where you go with that question of what do I do now? Because what Mandy does now and what Crystal does now may be different things. Maybe
Mhm.
what you do now is advocacy. Maybe that's what fills you. Maybe that's the thing that helps you now finally begin to feel soothing and rest. Maybe the thing I do is go no contact. And that's the thing that finally gets me to feel deep rest and self-soothing. That's how I see it. There's only so far that general information can take you. The rest is yours and it is mine and is the listeners.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. All right. Well, I say the right people and the resources come into your life at the right time. And this has been perfect timing for this conversation. And it's been a long time coming. I know we've been
I know,
talking about this for what, a year or two,
I know.
but it's
I'm so glad that
perfect.
you've done this. Yeah,
Yeah.
I feel the perfection too. Thank you so much for inviting me and for asking me again. I appreciate you. I appreciate your time and your platform. Thank you so much,
Well, I
Mandy.
appreciate you and the work that you do. Is there anywhere that you would like people to reach out to you?
Sure, you can visit my website, spiritclinic.com. And I've got a YouTube, I've got a TikTok. I mean, I have the accounts. So I'll, give you those links, Mandy, and perhaps you could put it in show notes.
For sure. I will do that. Thank you so much, Crystal. We appreciate you.
Thank you.
All right.